Okay, hello everyone. My name is Martin Entz, as I've been introduced, and I'm going to be talking today about, in this session, about two uh, parts of the whole farm um, seminar series, talk about farm resources and also planning. So I want to say at the outset, I'm really pleased to be able to host this seminar. It's really got me thinking much broader than just about the everyday agronomy about organic production. But I also recognize that, I think it's important that you recognize that this is my perspective. And so I don't have experience in all aspects of business or planning, but it's my attempt. So let's get started. Okay, so the first part I want to talk about is farm resources. And this slide shows four major sort of resource pieces of really any farm enterprise. And I want to talk about each of them individually briefly. We have the land resources. This is so critical to know what the resource is. Sometimes people talk about, class 2 land or class 6 land. I think that's true. There are different capabilities of lands, but there are possibilities on all types of land bases, even lands that have some salinity, even lands that have some slopes. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize. So one of the experiences that we had, a graduate student of mine, Myra Van Dee, looked at 6 operations that were involved in organic beef production, and they did grass-fed. Now, why did they do grass-fed? It's because their land was really well suited to growing perennials. And so what she did in her master's was to study these farms, dairy farms in Ontario, beef farms on the prairies, and found that these farmers had taken their land base and optimized its use through growing perennials and then producing livestock products. And those products happened to be certified organic and certified grass-fed. So I like to use this as an example of how we can use very different land bases and have some successful business. So this is one of those grass-fed beef farms in Western Manitoba. And I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of perennials on this farm. And if you look at the Google Maps shot with the different fields placed on it, you can see there's a lot of, well, you'll have to take my word for it, but there's a lot of hills, there's bush, there's salinity, there's water courses. And these farmers have optimized this land base by putting a lot of the land into perennials or grazing the native pastures that are there. And they're using the twice over grazing system, which is known to be very good for grazing native pastures on the prairies. It allows the health of the pasture to be maintained, especially during droughts. And then they have an 8-year organic crop rotation. And for example, the alfalfa is in blue, and you can see that here sprinkled throughout the farm. This is about a 2,000-acre farm. And there's also a grain rotation. So this is an example of how somebody has thought about a land base and used it sort of for optimum production. Okay, the second resource that farmers have is the human resource. This is the people who own or work or operate the farm. This one example is Villicus Farms in Montana. And I love this term called not family, but farmily. And the term farmily makes a lot of sense to me because I've seen a lot of farms where there's, some family members and some hired members and some maybe apprentices, which is what they do at Villicus Farms, or maybe some people in the community who help out during busy times. And a lot of farms operate that way. And so this term I first heard from a farmer in southwestern Manitoba. So I want to give them credit for the term Farmily. But the human resources are extremely, extremely important. And when we think about human resources, I do want to emphasize that there are some challenges. And one of them is, sexism faced by women farmers. Women make up almost 30% of owner-operators of Canadian farms. And if this is something that you'd like to learn more about, there's a very nice conversation podcast on the subject. The third piece in the sort of farm resource puzzle is the infrastructure. And when I think about infrastructure, I immediately think about machinery. And that's probably pretty relevant because machinery is a big part of farming. But if we look at the lower right-hand side of this collage of slides that I have here, we can also see livestock. And so livestock can play a very important part of the farm infrastructure. They have all kinds of services to offer, and livestock also produces manure. A question that we need to ask ourselves when we think about our infrastructure resources is what should come? What new things do we need? Like, for example, this roller crimper crimping sweet clover. And what should go? Should we get rid of the field sprayer? Maybe we will be spraying something on an organic farm. So these are questions that we need to ask ourselves, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this later. And then finally, we have markets. And there's other parts of the farm that maybe I'm not spending time on. These are the big four that come to my mind. So when we think about markets, I think this is something that farmers have a fairly good handle on. There are improving price discovery systems for organic crops. And I said at the bottom here, organic pricing limited as trade waits on new crop. That's from the latest Organic Biz magazine. Let me just share some history around markets that may or may not apply to us today. Von Thunen was an economist 200 years ago. And he came up with this von Thunen model of concentric land use. Back in the day when transportation was not what it is today, the heavy products, things like milk, they had to be produced close to the population center. And then the green circle is where forests were growing because they needed the timber and they also needed the firewood. And then the yellow is extensive field crops and the red is ranching, extensive livestock production. Now, why am I showing you something from 200 years ago? It doesn't make any sense. We have semi-trailers. Yesterday, I drove 700 kilometers there and back to a field day. Transportation systems are quite amazing these days. Well, I wanted to share this because I see farmers still taking advantage of proximity to markets. This is one example. 3Gen Organics, north of Kitchener, Ontario, organic pork production, also eggs, some honey. And they were selling in farmers markets and still do, but now actually have built a farm store. Now they happen to be close to large markets. And so the von Thunen model kind of works for them, and lucky them. And you can learn more about them by visiting these websites and watching this video. Now, most Canadians have heard Wayne Gretzky or have heard somebody quote Wayne Gretzky, and I've got it on the upper left-hand side of this slide, when he said, "I skate to where the puck is going, not to where it has been." So what does this mean for markets? Well, one little example is if we look at the bottom left-hand corner of this figure, this shows the food miles associated with specific organic foods in Canada. And what we see here is that fruit and vegetables consumes a lot of our food miles. And that's because we're importing them from other parts of the world, from the United States and elsewhere. And so if we think critically about the future or where the puck is going, if people are serious about reducing their food miles, and if transportation costs might go up with the focus on carbon reduction, is that an opportunity for organic farmers to think about growing vegetables? So ideas like the market gardener come to mind. And there certainly is research on this subject. So on the left here, we see some research in Europe, where they're looking at a combination of fruit production, in this case, apples, with grain production. And the question I have for myself is, what would it take to have sort of some fruit and vegetable production on a farm like the one I described earlier, that's several thousand acres large? I think that's a question that you should wrestle with and you can think about. Maybe you, as the primary producer, is not going to be involved in that, but maybe somebody in your community can partner with you on that. So there's ideas on how to expand markets. And in the spirit of going to where the puck is, skating to where the puck is going and not where it has been, we can also look at this article from a recent farm newspaper that looked at the idea that changing diets is important to reduce healthcare costs in Canada. And so flax pulses could reduce these costs. Are we growing enough of these foods? And if we grow them organically, is that over time going to be a more profitable market? And if we look at the global trends in human health, here, some shocking statistics about diabetes. It is on the rise, as is other unhealthy circumstances that people have. And so the idea of producing healthy food is definitely going to gain strength, not only in Canada and in Europe, but all over the world. If we look at India, for example, there's a projected 72% increase in diabetes. And so that could change the food market. And it's certainly something that organic farmers should be aware of. Okay, so I've talked about some of the resources on the farm, the land resources, the human resources, the infrastructure, the markets. How do I see this system? If I'm, operating a farm like this or part of the family, how do I really understand all these parts? And is the way that I understand it the same way that my partner might understand it, or that my children might understand it? And so I want to talk a little bit about mind mapping. And mind mapping is an exercise where you, kind of close your eyes and you put together a map of all the things that you see and all the connections of those things that you see. And this is an exercise that people have used through the ages. It's nothing new. Many of us are very visual in our thinking and our planning. And I want to show you a couple of examples of mind maps that students have made of organic farms. So here's one, for example. This is Organic Farm X. And this student has looked at the different components of that farm, the crop rotation, the cover crops, the biomass incorporation, shelter belts, and then looked at different connections. So the increased seeding rate is used to outcompete weeds. Weather affects organic crop insurance. It also is connected to fast-growing varieties that use less water. Reducing farm size is something that helps with the labor demands of the farm, and but that would only work if they were getting higher prices for their foods or for their crop products. So you may not agree with this person's mind map, but this is the way one person saw the farm and saw some of the connections. And here's one that really applies today, where a lot of organic farmers are struggling. The conventional prices have been so good. And people are saying, well, is my farm economically sustainable? And how do I keep doing that? So is there some kind of a consistent subsidy available for something that I do on my farm that can help me sustain it economically through rough times? Here's another mind map that another student made of another farm. So this is Organic Farm Y. And I like some of the connections here. Here is one, the buildings, okay? The buildings, and some of those buildings were chicken barns. And that farmer wanted to enhance the housing system because, of course, a lot of poultry production, especially eggs, you want, you know, a lot of the consumers want organic eggs that are also free run or somehow in an enhanced housing, not in these cages. And that was linked on this farm to peer-to-peer learning. So somehow this farmer had learned about enhanced housing from perhaps another poultry farmer. Other connections here, we have marketing being linked to enhanced housing, or manure storage being linked to manure application, or soil testing being linked to government policy, or machinery being linked to shelter belts. Maybe that means that shelter belts are limiting the size of machinery. So whatever the example, the important thing about mind mapping is it lets you see the whole picture and lets you make connections between the different parts of your farm system. Okay, so that was part one, where we're looking at the farm resources and thinking about them. In the next section, I want to talk a little bit about planning. And there's a term that I'm often reminded of, and that is we don't plan to fail, but sometimes we fail to plan. And that would describe some of the things I've done. And I think planning is really important. In the chapter that accompanies these videos, I have broken up the planning into agronomic planning, so that's rotation, landscape planning, and then an emphasis on data and record keeping. I've also have a section on business planning, and then some threats or interesting, for me, interesting phenomena. One is on the question of optimum farm size. And the other one is, what is the threat of rising land costs to the way we plan organic agriculture? Okay, now I've made my little outline go to the side of this slide, and I've brought into the center a sort of typical strategic planning hierarchy. And so when we're planning, we should really start with a vision and then a mission. And the tactics, the things that we do every day, like I'm going to, intercrop my peas with oats instead of mustard. Well, that's not where we should start our planning. We should start with, what is our long-term vision for the farm? What is our mission? And another example of this planning hierarchy has some of the same parts. Right at the top is the vision, and then the mission. And then it has an additional yellow one, and it's called values. And that is the beliefs of the farm, the beliefs of the family, of the owner of the farm, of the family that runs the farm. These three things are very important: vision, mission, values, and then what are the strategic goals of the farm? And then the projects, like I said, intercropping peas with oats instead of intercropping peas with mustard, that sort of falls out of all the plans, of all the mission, vision, and oops, I'm so sorry. And what I'm always reminded to do in our household is that if I have an idea, I've got to run it through this filter. Is it part of the vision? Is it part of the mission? Is it part of the, does it meet the values? Does it meet the short-term and long-term strategies? So I think a lot of you will be familiar with strategic planning, but it is important. And I would recommend that any farm go through a strategic planning exercise. It may sound to you sometimes that, well, this is only for like big corporations or for public institutions like university departments. It's for everybody. And when you think about the value and all the infrastructure on farms, you know, they are also very expensive. There's lots of resources tied up in them, and a plan is a good idea. Of course, when we plan, we have to recognize that every farm is different. And so if we look at Canada, we've got vastly different growing conditions, geographies, markets, proximity to market is different. And then if we look at the prairies, we've got these different soil zones. The black soil zone is typically wetter. Over here, it's drier. So the farm system would be different. And what I've done is tacked on the northern US states, sort of lined them up kind of where they would fit relative to the prairies. And then we've got this line here that's just south of where I am in Winnipeg that really depicts the transition between what we call the corn belt and the wheat belt. And just for me, one really interesting example there is if we're going to grow a livestock feed in the green or the slightly green area, we might grow corn. But if we're down here in Kansas, in this drier area, we might grow sorghum. And so we should plan differently. And sorghum biologically is more heat tolerant than corn. So it makes sense. So every farm is different, not only based on very vast differences of geography, but also differences of family culture, of community, of the family, etc., age, etc. Now, in the notes that accompany this, I've got different examples of crop rotations, and these are real live crop rotations from different parts of Canada. And at the bottom, I've highlighted some of the features of these crop rotations. So this one in Quebec here, they use a lot of manure to supply the nitrogen. There's less legume in there than is actually required to supply all the nitrogen. And so what you can do is visit these farms and then find out why they use a specific rotation. And that's really what I'm trying to communicate here, is to understand why people use the rotations they did. And of course, I would assume in Quebec, it's because they have access to livestock manure. If we look at this Alberta example, one of the features is there's a green manure every third year in the rotation. So with rising land costs, I would go to that farmer and say, why are you actually only growing a crop that you can market, 4 years out of 6? and the other 2 years you're growing soil building, nitrogen building crops. And I'd be interested to hear their reason. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is that as you plan, whether you've been farming for a long time or you're just starting your organic journey, visit farms, go to farm tours when you have the opportunity, and then really try to drill down and understand why people use the specific rotations that they do. Now, I mentioned rising farmland costs, and that is a reality. We've seen this all over the country. And so this actually forces a little bit of a trade-off. Because as the price of land goes up and the land payments go up, the pressure to produce a crop every year goes up as well. So I want to show this example here from the Glenlee rotation, where we're putting rotation excellence against sort of financial pressure. So this is a picture I took about a month ago, and this is an organic oat crop. And the front half, the oats look much better than the back half. And in the back half, I'll show you the rotation in a minute. The back half has an inadequate number of legumes in rotation. The front half has a more adequate group of legumes in rotation, and that's why it's growing better. Now here's the same field several weeks later. You can really see the difference. And you'll notice right away that the front half here, where we've had the legumes, we've got more nitrogen. The back half is much paler. And then this is what the picture looks like 2 days ago, because today is July 13th, 2023. And now I'm going to explain what the rotation actually looks like. The back half has the green manure, then wheat, then flax, and then oats. And it's been that way for over 30 years. And so that's actually a good rotation, but I mean, it could use a few more legumes, maybe a legume cover crop with the flax or something. But after 3 decades, this is actually the 32nd organic crop. After that period of time, that rotation is not doing very well. It's got a lot of wild oats, it's got some thistle, and it's really not profitable. The front part of the plot actually has the same rotation, a green manure, then wheat, then flax, and then oats. But we were noticing the problems of lack of nitrogen, the problems of declining soil structure, the problems of more thistle. And so what we did is we planted alfalfa here for 5 years. And so we hit the pause button on the grain production, and then we had 5 years of alfalfa. And then in 2020, we planted a green manure, then wheat, then flax, and now an oats in 2023. And so what we did in this rotation is we actually rehabilitated the system. The concern that I have is as people run into challenges with their long-term organic systems and the pressure to produce a harvestable crop every year to meet the markets or make the land payments, there's a compromise of the system. And eventually, I mean, as you can see by these images, the system kind of falls apart. Whereas if we made this decision to rehabilitate, the system is actually better than ever. So that's what I'm suggesting in terms of planning. Sometimes we have to plan something, and that's maybe a little unconventional for our crop rotation. And there are ways of achieving income from crops like alfalfa. And the proof here is quite striking. A similar study in Beltsville, Maryland, another one of these old organic crop rotation studies, really shows the same effect. What they're showing here is the net return in dollars per hectare. And they've got the two conventional systems, no-till and chisel plow. So the no-till conventional is more profitable than the chisel plow conventional. And then here we have the profitability of 3 organic systems, a 6-year rotation, a 3-year rotation, a 2-year rotation. And this is the percentage of organic premium that's required to make this rotation intersect with these conventional ones. And so one of the things that I want to illustrate here is by going to this longer rotation, which includes 2 years of alfalfa, it takes a much smaller organic premium to be as profitable as the best conventional system, compared to these rotations, which only include grain crops. This one is corn, soybean. This one is corn, soybean, wheat. And then the final example on some of the sort of profitability of these systems in the long term is, again, another 30-year data set. This one comes from Indian Head, Saskatchewan. And Bob Zentner is retired now, but he was an economist with Agriculture Canada for many, many years. And using the long-term rotation at Indian Head, he looked at the overall performance. So let me just explain this graph, because you do see them in the literature. On this axis, it has expected net income. Okay, that's net income. And here is standard deviation of income on the bottom x-axis. So this is the variation in income. And the efficiency frontier is the most profitable you can be. And so what they looked at is these, and I know these rotations are not really, they're not organic, and they're not really great rotations, but they make a point. So fallow wheat rotations, which he called monoculture, had a pretty good net income, but a very high level of risk. And when they purchased crop insurance, they reduced their risk by this much. Another rotation which existed in the long-term study there at Indian Head, and this rotation is still going on, by the way, is a fallow wheat, 3 years of alfalfa brome for hay. And this is the profitability of what I call the integrated forage grain system. And here it is with all-purpose crop insurance. So what this shows us is that if we want to look at risk reduction, the rotation was much more powerful than the insurance program. They had similar net returns, but the risk, which is the standard deviation, was much, much lower here. So, these are results that have been calculated or observed by researchers over decades. So let's bring this back to a practical farming system. And I'm going to use the example of Howe Park Farms again. This is the Grossarts farm in Western Manitoba. The area in this white area here, that's the organic farm. And right next to it is a conventional farm. Basically canola, wheat, soybean, which is what conventional farmers in Manitoba tend to focus on. The organic farm looks very different, or it may look different. It's more diverse. You can see the water drainage, there's more potholes. All this ecological material has been left intact. But what I really want to make the point here, what I really want to say here is that the farm on the right really relies heavily on financial risk management tools when it gets into trouble. And the organic farm might also rely on things like crop insurance, which is a financial risk management tool, but it relies very heavily on managing risk biologically. And I call that biological risk management. And by having these rotations that are better, we are introducing biology into the rotation, which allows us to manage risk just by virtue of having a better system. So that's a lot to take on board, and you can read the notes to get more elaboration on this. And it doesn't mean that the conventional farm doesn't use good biology. They could no-till, they might use cover crops. But the organic farm, and if we look at some of the evidence, the diversity of rotation in this case with perennials, really does allow a lot of extra risk management. Okay, I want to give an example of a farm that has gone through strategic planning, a strategic planning exercise. And I'd like to acknowledge Matthew de Wavrennes from Quebec for sharing these slides with me. So this is an organic farm outside of Montreal. It's close to 2,000 acres. It's been in existence for organic for about over 20 years now. And what's fascinating about this farm is they've actually gone through the strategic planning process. They have values, they have a mission. And so one of their missions is self-sufficiency in inputs, in marketing, in infrastructure, and in machinery design and maintenance. They have designed a manure spreader. They've designed an inter-row cover crop seeder. They've designed a piece of tillage equipment which allows them to kill perennials in one pass. They've designed a piece of machinery that pulls weeds out of organic soybeans. They've also thought about soil conservation, and this is also part of their mission to improve soil conservation. So they've gone to a ridge tillage system, which is very uncommon in Eastern Canada. Most organic farmers would be moldboard plowing. They've used green manure cover crops, limited use of manure, light equipment, traffic control, all aimed at soil conservation. And they have included biodiversity in their objectives, values, and mission, organic certification, shelter belt, strip cropping, habitat preservation, and enrichment. Here they've got towers for bats. They've got cover crops and other things, shelter belts, that strip cropping, which maintains biodiversity. And vertical integration was also important to them. And so they have a flour mill on their farm, and they mill wheat right in Quebec, wheat that is grown in Quebec. They test it for DON because fusarium is a reality. And they do all the right things. They hold back some wheat from a dry year, which is low DON, and so they sell into the greater Montreal area and into Vermont and Boston, and you can buy their flour there. So I wanted to share this because I wonder how many farms have really gone through the strategic plan. And I think that this farm has been successful organically through good times and bad times because they kind of had a plan, and they had a vision, they had values. And one of their values was to stay organic. They did not want to go back to spraying chemicals. And so, and that's very easy to do. And we see farmers doing that now, and it's a free country, and some farmers are just in a position where they have no choice. But planning, missions, value, very important. And I want to end off today just the planning part and asking the question, is there an optimum farm size for organic? Yeah, I don't really have the answer to the question. I just have the question. But when I look across the country, I can see farms, organic farms. This is the one that I just talked about in Quebec. They were 1,500 acres at the time. Right next to it is a 20-acre farm. I'll come back to it. And then in Quebec, the largest farm in Quebec is actually an organic farm. It's 7,000 acres. Two farms in Manitoba, Poplar Grove, 44,000 acres, Howe Park, about 2,000 acres, and then Fraserland Organics is 2,000 acres. A couple of interesting things that I've observed with these farms. Fraserland Organics here in British Columbia and AgriFusion in Quebec both of those circumstances are three families coming together to amalgamate their farms. So their family is quite broad and probably brings a lot of skills. This 20-acre farm to me is fascinating. It actually supports three families. They grow vegetable seeds. They also do seminars and do education. And they rent the land from this farm. And so when I think about that question I posed earlier, how can we put vegetable production into a place like Howe Park Farm? Well, maybe those young people who have the energy to grow vegetables for local markets, they just need some help, like some land and maybe some equipment to do some tillage. And that's exactly what happened here. And this is a successful farm. So organic farming can happen many different ways, and it comes in many different shapes and sizes. But if we talk to an economist about this, they're going to say, yes, that's all very nice. There may be exceptions, but in order to get, sort of value out of your investment, you got to either be really small or really big. And so this is the graph, what they call the theory of you, not me and you, but you. Okay, so on the left axis, we've got total factor productivity. And this is sort of how much profit you're going to get. And then farm size, when you're really small, like vegetable cropping, you can be very profitable on about 1 hectare of land per person, so 2.5 acres. And that's because you can maximize your labor efficiency. As that farm gets bigger, the labor efficiency goes down. You have to invest in machines. And so if you're going to invest in machines, the economists show us you should be larger so that you can buy bigger and more efficient machines. And so this leaves us with this theoretical theory of you, where total factor productivity is highest on very small farms and on very large farms. And farms in the middle are the ones that, they can't afford all the technology that the larger farmers have. Now, my question is that applies in a conventional farming system. In an organic farming system, where ecological knowledge is critical to the success of the farm, does that mean that the optimum farm size is a little bit smaller than these really large ones? And my theory is that the answer is yes. When organic farms are of a certain size where ecological knowledge, you can get payback on your ecological knowledge. And I'll talk about ecological knowledge in the learning module. Then my theory is that those modest size farms are more profitable, or could be potentially more profitable. So we can discuss that. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this module. Thank you very much for your attention. And just to recap, what I've elaborated on in this session is the farm resources to optimize organic production. And then I talked about the planning process to achieve that. So I'm going to sign off now. Thank you so much for your attention.